spotlight, the only person who gets recorded is myself. So, in case you were wondering what that little red dot was. Okay, so make sure you can put the room around you, of course, and just start our usual way, gently turning in the middle of your body, hips, waist. Weight a little bit forwards. Just let your hips drop back. Make some slow, gentle breaths. Just give yourself a few moments for settling in, physically and in your mind. And both of those really, it's an advantage to focus your attention down into your feet. As always, body and mind are not seen as being separate. So your attention going to your feet would tend to draw your weight downwards. It's a familiar feeling, familiar posture for all of you, hopefully. But it always takes a few moments for that to happen. So as always, the warm-up is as much about the mind settling in as it is about what happens physically to our body. But we also want to get that feeling of a movement through the body, the blood circulating. Because you're going a little bit faster, there'll be a slight effect on your breathing. Surprisingly, when I came across a study on aerobic qualities of various exercises, and mostly when we look at those kinds of studies, we see sort of like faster, higher impact exercise. But Tai Chi scored reasonably well. I mean, it wasn't the highest level of aerobic development, but it's by no means the lowest either, which suggests that it's not just about sort of burning up calories and working up a sweat and panting and puffing, but the effect that our posture has on just the whole physiology of our body. Remember, in this posture, when I drop my weight back, it's the back of my body, and in particular the central part of my back, that is really supporting the front of the body. So ribs, all the internal organs and so on and so forth seem to hang slightly. And that means that there's less tendency to sort of pull in, to tighten up in muscles of your chest and your belly. Just allows the lungs more space. So again, we come back to this idea that the posture allows a certain amount of space for movement within the body. It allows for a movement that is more harmonious. You don't want, for instance, if you breathe in, you don't want to be fighting against the tightness of the muscles in your chest. You want everything to work as a sort of cooperative unit, really. And then raising your arms. Good, and let your hands down. Now just letting your weight sway forwards and backwards. The quality that we look for in our body is one of alignment. The Chinese term is quite interesting to consider. Zhongding is the term, which I always think sounds great, and it generally translates as something like central equilibrium. And I think that's, some people say central balance, but I think the idea of an equilibrium has perhaps more scope to it than just the word balance. And so one of the first things that we seek is this equilibrium, this alignment in the body. And we know that some of the exercises sort of push at the boundaries of that a little bit. It's always something that we come back to. And it is literally central to everything that happens in Tai Chi. I know of at least 3 significant schools of Tai Chi that are based the name of their school on the term Zhongding, or central equilibrium. And even one teacher, quite a senior Chinese teacher, who when he moved to this country, gave himself an English name, gave himself the name Zhongding, based on that, which perhaps gives an idea of the significance that it's regarded in. So what we find with this exercise is, we know there's that central point, maybe with your weight just behind the balls of your feet or wherever you find it. And then we can move out from that a little bit, but there always comes that point where we tense up. So that quality of Zhongding, or rather the qualities that are inherent in Zhongding, actually begin to describe an area rather than a particular point. So now, just sway gently from side to side. The weight will move a little bit, the pelvis tilts slightly. And then combine the two, so go around in a circle. I'll come a little bit closer so you can see my feet. And I'm going forwards, so I feel the weight in my sort of balls of the feet, my toes. And I go over to one side and I feel my weight on the edge there, back into the heel, and the weight on the heel, and then over to the other heel, and then forward along that edge, and so on. So every now and then that will happen. I would argue that it should happen, really, because, don't get caught up on I must do this exercise perfectly, because it's really something that informs the other exercises. And in particular, when we're doing this and we've got this sort of circular movement kind of pivoting from the ankles, you start to register the difference in feeling within your body between here, say, and then here. You just notice when that tightening up builds, and that tightening, you feel it first, say, probably in some of the joints of the body, but effectively beginning to constrict the movement. It radiates out really from your feet, from your central skeleton. Imagine doing this in water. The skeleton I've described before as being like a sort of plant just swaying in water, and the resonance of that movement, the waves of that movement, just expanding out through tissues and organs, through rib cage and so on. And then go back the other way. Hold your hands out and lift it out from your body, and again use this image of carrying a tray of drinks, and just try and feel that movement in your feet enables this circular movement that you'll start to recognize in your hands, and the combination of the image, the intent behind the movement, and the alignment of your body will start to give you an idea of how that movement that comes from your feet is transmitted up through your body, goes out through your arms. It's a bit trickier with your arms out, I think. If you just notice what's happening, say, in your legs at the moment, you can almost feel at times this movement of the skeleton, the movement of the big muscles of your legs. You want to try and feel the same thing in your arms. It's very subtle. And just gradually make the movement smaller, so you begin to just spiral into a central position. Drop your hands down and just letting your body come to rest. 50% of your weight in each foot, and then just sinking down and pushing up. So we want to try and maintain that quality of movement all the way through the body for all of the movements that we do. And again, this is where memory can be quite useful. If you can get a sense for that movement in that earlier exercise and just recall that every now and then going through some of the other exercises, that can help you to just generate that same qualities. It's a slow process. Every now and then you get a glimpse of this working for you. So try not to get frustrated. Recognize this is one of those ongoing things in Tai Chi that really we are all constantly working with. Easy and gently. Sometimes just the recollection of that quality of movement changes how you move. Depends partly on how familiar you are with the particular exercise that we're doing. Other times you might need to sort of think, well, okay, what am I doing with my hips, my arms, and so on. Now change into the wild goose. One thing that can disturb that quality of movement and take us further from it is letting our arms sort of take over the movement. If I show you from here, I'll exaggerate a bit, my hands out. As I come up, my hips stop and my hand stops. But what happens is my elbow is now dropping down, so that sends my hand up a little bit. My hips are pulling my elbow down. And then as I start to push up, the elbow is pushed out. And now the hips are going down and the elbow is going down. The momentum in my arm carries on into my hands and fingers. So I sometimes say, if your hips go up, your hands go up. If your hips go down, your hands go down. But it might be more interesting for you to think at this point about not your hands connected to your hips, but your elbows. And then change into heart in the clouds. Same thing here. If I exaggerate, to see how my elbows are going out. But eventually they'll just stop moving, and that's when my hands swing out. So these are good exercises for just playing around with some of these basic ideas and principles in Tai Chi, because they're simple, you're familiar with them. And if you can begin to find some of those qualities that we find within central equilibrium in these exercises, which by no means easy, by the way, it's simple but not easy, then it increases the chances that you'll find them in some of the later exercises. And then dragon plucks the stars from the sky. Another thing that we register when we start to look at these very subtle internal elements in Tai Chi is that there are parts of the body where we don't feel those qualities of movement, where the flow somehow is being blocked. So we can use various approaches to try and work with those blocks, to try and dissolve those blocks. You might even find that just recognizing them is enough. You might want to think about, you might want to get quite analytical about it. Yeah. How is that working? Is my shoulder in line? So on and so forth. We want to use an image. I quite like the idea that the movement is like water in a river flowing over a rock and gradually wearing it away. And any and all of those can be quite useful at times. Some people like to imagine breathing into those areas, breathing out the blocked energy. And there are all ways in which we bring our attention into play. My recommendation would be to try and get used to all of those ways of doing things rather than stuck on one way, because what we don't want to do is to get to a point where we get stuck if we stick one way. And then pushing in 4 directions. And again, it tends to be these earlier exercises, these simpler, more familiar exercises that we can begin to really play with those ideas with. But also you might find that there's a particular exercise that works for you in a particular part of your body. Most exercises have more than one aspect to them, to be honest. But obviously some will work in some parts of the body better than others. I've had people say to me that this exercise, for instance, always seems to help to generate, for people, not always, but for some people it will generate the sense of the flow, the rhythm of the movement. Doesn't make sense, it's fairly straightforward, and we can feel that connection to the center of the body and that rhythm of expanding and contracting. One more time. Good, and then circling palms. First of all, without the turn. Just appreciating the expansion and both upwards and outwards in that side of your body. as your arm swings up. Quite a strong expansion in that side of your chest. Still remember, weight slightly forwards, hips dropping back. This time, if it's comfortable, be careful not to pull hard on your hip. It's turning. And then switch sides. And again, if it's comfortable, turn. So this is quite strong as you turn, but remember that feeling of space within your body. So even though you are sort of working the muscles quite hard, again, you shouldn't be pressing in on that space. Now, rowing a boat in the middle of the lake. Again, quite a strong exercise, but again, trying to maintain that internal sense of movement, of flow. Let's do one more. And stand. So those two approaches to working with blocks and tension in the body to get very specific with the exercise, very much dependent on training your attention, training your awareness to be in your body. It's the mind that leads that process in one way or another. So it's no good if you can't do it if you're wondering what you're going to have for lunch or something like that. And they're sometimes divided into two approaches. One is called the fire method, one is called the water method. Some people like to practice these quite differently, by the way. So in some schools of Tai Chi and Qigong, you'll get exercises that are the water method exercises and others that are the fire method exercises. Or you can sort of take the approach that I do, which is that it's actually about how you're approaching it, how you're approaching it in your mind. The fire, as the name suggests, is more intrusive, more precise. You might be breathing into a very particular spot. You might be analyzing your posture and so on and so forth. Water is still very precise in its sense, but in more kind of flowing, water flowing over the rock, the rhythm of the movement, the massaging quality of the movement, and so on and so forth. And I think you can apply that to the same exercise. I think it's quite useful to move between the two. If you get too caught up in being really precise and concerned about, say, your posture, for instance, that can have a negative effect after a while. It's almost becomes almost tunnel vision. And when we find that's happening, it's quite good to come back to the flow. But the flow won't always be as effective. So, you know, finding a balance between the two, what suits you at any particular time is actually important. Right, so now just coming back to the standing. A couple of slow, gentle breaths. Bring your hands around in front of you. Do stretching between heaven and earth. So I need to go back. So remember my movements. Your right hand pushing up, left hand pushing down. Remember the hand staying in front of your body very much. So you can see my front hand clearly. My top hand is clearly in front. My bottom hand, you know, hasn't come back here. It's about there, slightly in front of my hip, and then turn hands in. And push up. So you feel it's on a slight diagonal in the way that I do this, although, as I've said before, there are many variations. Sinking down a little bit and pushing up, extending, contracting. And it's very much the case, stretching between heaven and earth. So your top hand is facing up towards the sky, bottom hand down towards the ground. As always with this exercise, there's a number of stages we can go through. Let's finish with slightly athletic quality of standing on one leg, if that suits you. Don't feel forced to take it any further than you are now. Nothing wrong with just staying in one particular way of doing it. Remember, this is not a competition. So again, it's what suits you at any particular time. But I'll just take you through them. So this time your weight drops, but as you get to the bottom, you go across into the opposite side. So more of an expansion on one side, coming back to the middle, cross into your other foot. Make sure you settle down in your foot before you push up. And as you expand, if you imagine that the expansion comes from this image of a ball held in the middle of your body, that ball will push downwards as well as upwards. So even as you extend up, you're maintaining your connection to the ground. And then this time, you come down and across, and you can bring the opposite foot in and push up. So now you hold the ball, you step out, move across, settle into the foot, bring this foot in, push up. And the final stage, if it suits you, is to raise the foot, which should happen with just a simple rotation of your hip. Be careful when you go down. You can go down quite a long way, but as always, pay attention to what's going on in your body and don't force the movement. And stretching between heaven and earth. And then One of the things that I found working with this exercise and one or two other exercises, which involve standing on one leg. As always, I would reiterate, I'm not a great fan of standing on one leg. I don't see it as a particular advantage in most situations, but it's quite kind of interesting to play. But two things that I've noticed make a difference. One is really having a good sense of what my foot is doing. This idea of the foot sinking into the ground, about pushing the foot down in the ground, rather than my thoughts out there somewhere, to always retain that as an anchor. And the other thing that applies to this exercise, I think, is the rhythm of the movement. Rather than thinking here, oh, I've got to stick my hand up in the air and stand on one leg, I just try and think of my body expanding and then contracting, rather than too many details of the exercise. So go back to that kind of basic rhythm. And it's interesting, I think, just how significant the awareness becomes. Now, come forwards again a little bit. Swimming dragon. This is, I think probably not all of you have done this actually with me. Remember, this is a strong exercise on the back. We start with our feet hip width apart. Usually, this exercise is done with feet tight and legs tight together. I'll change to that after a while. You should only do that if it's comfortable. It's a little bit gentler to do it like this. So again, be careful of your back, and just tilting your pelvis from side to side. And when you do this, imagine that your spine just gently curves. So it's not your head going; it's your whole body just sort of bending over. Imagine a piece of wood curved over, nice and even all the way through, or sort of like a bow and arrow. I'm exaggerating this, by the way. I'm doing this quite big. It's a much smaller movement normally. Hands held together, fingers pointing up to start off with, and just notice how your hands move with you. Point your fingers in the direction that the hand's moving. So don't lock your knees. Be careful of your knees, especially if you go into the narrower stance. And then thinking of these three circles, the three Dan chins, the belly, chest, the solar plexus, and the head. To go around the first circle, drop your weight a little bit. Be careful of your knees. Take your hand around. Come up slightly. Go in between belly and the solar plexus. And then in between the solar plexus and your head across the throat. And then over the top. That top one, again, can be quite tight. So as always, very carefully. And back down. Down again for that lower one. You can lean forwards a little bit, but also just let your hips drop a little. Nice, smooth, flowing feeling through your spine. This is the swimming dragon. I went up a little bit high there, really, for this one. I'm going to bring my feet together, but make your mind up about what suits you. So obviously a movement that is going to work your back. Go very carefully with that. You don't want to start pulling your vertebrae out of line, but you do get that little bit of movement between them. Now, go back the other way. And nice to feel that a fluid movement in your spine. Make this the last one. Good. And shake out. So that's swimming dragon. Now go into bear play. Remember that slight up and down movement with the rolling of your hips, your shoulders, your hands following. And I think between them, bear play and swimming dragon give us a sense for the movement, the energy that can be generated through the spine. So earlier, when we were doing that circling movement, I was talking about what was happening in the feet, in the skeleton. Spine and back are very important. And both swimming dragon and bear play sort of push right at the edges of the posture and that quality of central equilibrium. Many of the exercises, and particularly the ones that are more related to the Tai Chi forms, you wouldn't move anything like this far. But again, use these movements to give you a sense for the movement that radiates out from your back. It's a really important part of the body, of course, for all sorts of reasons. And so when we come to things like pushing away, for instance, which is from a postural point of view, much more economic movement, but we want to retain that feeling of movement in the whole of the body. And so our back is really important for that. I mean, apart from any intrinsic value to our backs, of course. So bear play and swimming dragon are two interesting exercises from that point of view, I think. Good, and then come backwards. 1 foot forwards. Transferring your weight. When we did the circling movement, there was a very small amount of movement, really, comparatively speaking, in the feet. And a relatively small amount of effort there, which built up through the body. And it's the same thing here. This movement starts, say, if your weight's in your back foot, the gentle sort of push down, or again, the stretching between heaven and earth. I talked about the idea of the ball expanding and contracting. You can think about the same thing here. But it's almost like you do this. The ball contracts or is pressed down, and then it expands and it pushes you up. But rather than going up, what it does is it pushes you back. And then the same thing in the back foot. But it's not a movement that you should be able to see. It's something you want to be able to feel. I suppose you could try and do it so you can see it, but no. So the key thing here is to just let your weight drop down, let the ball compress. And again, we start to feel that movement come into the spine. You think about the bear play, feeling the movement there, swimming dragon. So your spine isn't this rigid pole in your back, but it's a living, breathing part of your body. And then hands out in front of you, so you're carrying the tray of drinks. Or pushing the supermarket trolley if you prefer the image. Imagine a table in front of you, you've got the tray. As you go out, you're just going to gently put the tray down and then pick it up again. But it is never that jerky movement. So we use that movement that comes from the expansion in our leg to generate the movement into our arms and our hands. Raising your toes and your heel. This is generally quite a linear movement. It goes up through the length of your body. And then hit the step in. So it's not that the hands don't do anything. They're doing quite a lot if you use that image of carrying the tray of drinks. But again, it's how they do it. Good. And on the other side, just sort of drop your hands down. Let's get this basic movement. This is an exercise that really does repay hours of practice. Some of you would have heard me say this before, but it's actually the third exercise I ever did when I started Tai Chi. That was in 1983. And I've done it most days since then, I think. And yet it still has the capacity to reveal ideas. And it still remains one of the most important exercises for our mobility, to keep the legs conditioned, to keep the joints mobile, to enable us to maintain the stability, to enable us to maintain that quality of central equilibrium in movement, which is no easy thing to do. Bring your hands out in front. Start to raise your toes and your heel a little. And then step in. Then we'll take a few steps forwards or backwards. Always that depends on where you've got the room to step. Whichever way, make sure you plant the foot first. Give that a little bit of a push into the ground. Make sure you've got the connection. Don't do it too long a step or you won't be able to do that. Try and keep the width of your step. And then going back the other way. Feel the quietness of the movement in your arms and your hands. Good. And then bring your feet back. Now have your right foot forward so you can mirror my movements. And remember this movement that I sometimes add in. This arm is out here slightly curved just by the side of the body. And what I do is I rotate my arm, and what that does is you feel the connection again between shoulder to elbow, and it just brings the hand slightly behind and then forward. And when we do it with both arms, there's a sort of, if I exaggerate here, it's sort of, see how my chest opens out, the back contracts, and then I can pull my my sternum in, and that brings the hands around. Again, that's very exaggerated. This is a very subtle feeling. So right foot forwards, weight back, hands at your sides here, and just rotate them so they're palm forwards. And imagine either side of your body a round pillar, the sort of thing you get in car parks. Stop the cars bashing into each other. And then as you go forwards, just rotate. And so now we start to feel that expansion and contraction in the upper body, not just up and down, but across the chest and across the upper back. So we're gradually learning to be aware of how what we often think of as different parts of the body, feet, hips, ribs, are actually part of a whole unit, and the ways in which those areas interact with each other. And they're not fixed. You can do one exercise and think, oh, it works like that, but then there are different exercises, oh, it's working that way now. So this is not a kind of, we're not rigid machines, and it's really the awareness as much as anything else that you're developing. This time, sit back. Instead of going forwards, let your hands roll in, and this time let them come right in over your belly. So now, the chest is expanding as you go forwards, going into pigeon spreads its wings. Quite often we find in these arts, somebody will teach an exercise and they'll say, this shows you the connection between this part of the body and this part of the body. This is how it works. It works like that. And then sometimes I've found that another exercise will connect the same two parts of the body, but perhaps in the other direction or in a slightly different way. And they're all valid, but as I say, it's not fixed. It's like a road system. Once you've learned how it works, there are all sorts of twists and turns and shortcuts and changes of direction you can make once you're familiar with it. So once you're familiar with that inner landscape of the body, there are various ways you can choose to move things. Now, your hands drop down, going forwards. Because when we go forwards, the hands lag behind. Again, there's that expansion in the chest, and the contraction helps to bring your hands through. And same thing with the upper back as you go back. An awareness of those patterns, an awareness of how that inner landscape can work, can also be an advantage, going back to something I was saying earlier about encouraging different parts of the body to release. A very crude example could be, for instance, if you're doing this and you're feeling that your shoulders are a bit stuck, you might want to just focus your attention on your weight moving and your chest opening and closing. Don't even think about the shoulders, but rather use those movements that build into the swinging of the arms to generate the energy through your shoulders. This time we're going to change to pushing a wave. One more time. Come into your back foot, turn towards the front foot, and wind blows the willows. Chest expands, contracts, sinking into the front foot. Actually, not just the chest, but the whole of the upper body. And so going back to applying some of these movements and some of these practices to particular parts in the body.
Thanks very much. I've got to leave you early.
All right, okay.
Yep, cheers.
Okay. Sometimes it can be an advantage to bring the focus of your attention to that particular part of the body. Other times, that can reinforce the tension. So we, in a way, distract ourselves and look to some other part of the body. There's no fixed way of doing this. So now, have your left foot forwards and sink your weight back, turn your hands palm forwards. So we're getting quite a lot of movement in our arms for relatively little effort. And again, that's quite useful to note. The phrase in Tai Chi is that 4 ounces will overcome 1,000 pounds or move 1,000 pounds. This time, when you go back, we're going to change to pigeon spreads its wings. And then fisherman cast the net. Now, push them away. Remember that being the movement through your back. One more time. And wind blows the willows. Transfer the weight, sink, feel the expansion, pushing up through your body. Good. And shake out. Okay, rubbing your hands together. Tapping over your face. Over your head and neck. That's one shoulder. Side. Into your back. Legs. Light on your belly. So, back to standing. And Brace Tiger, return to the mountain. Sinking down. Pushing up and out. Already feeling though the seed of the return in the pull of gravity. Still working gently through your body. One more time. And shake out. That's great. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yep.